Welcome to today's Explainer. I'm going to be your history professor today, and we're diving right into the boiling point, that fascinating, rapidly escalating tension that drove the 13 colonies into a full-blown revolution against the British Crown. We're going to examine the exact pressure cooker that created the United States, breaking down this incredibly complex sequence of events step by step. Let's get right into it. Here's the syllabus for our Explainer today. We're going to trace the rapid action versus reaction timeline that turned everyday British subjects into American revolutionaries. We'll hit the turning point, rising taxes, violent crackdowns, the final straw, and ultimately declaring independence. Okay, Section 1, the turning point and the inciting incident. To really get this, we first need to understand the baseline of life in colonial America before any conflict actually began. Like, what was the status quo across the Atlantic? Well, for decades, the colonies experienced this British policy known as salutary neglect. Basically, this meant London was intentionally avoiding the strict enforcement of parliamentary laws. Because the colonies were largely just left alone to manage their own local affairs, they naturally began to foster this deeply ingrained, distinct American spirit. And with that came a fierce sense of independence. I mean, they were getting very used to governing themselves. However, the British perspective, fundamentally different. Their worldview was rooted in mercantilism. This meant London ultimately regarded the American colonies as existing primarily for the benefit of the mother country. To the Crown, the colonies were literally just an economic engine, perfectly designed to fuel the British Empire's global wealth. So, here comes the inciting incident of our timeline, the real spark that changes everything. It's the French and Indian War, which wrapped up in 1763. Now, this conflict successfully removed the French threat from North America and vastly expanded British territory. But ironically, this war, where, by the way, a young George Washington actually fought for the British, came at a massive, tremendous cost. It left the British Empire completely financially drained. Suddenly, the Crown is just drowning in war debt. So, I pose this question to you. How exactly does a massive empire pay off its crippling war debt? How did King George III and the British Parliament actually decide to balance their books after such a wildly costly military victory? That brings us to Section 2, taxes and rising tensions, or the economic squeeze. To pay off that mountain of debt, they looked directly across the Atlantic. They looked straight at the colonies, ushering in an era of unprecedented economic pressure, and abruptly, and I mean abruptly, ending that long-standing policy of salutary neglect. Let's look at how the timeline of events builds from here. First, the Crown physically restricted the colonists with the Royal Proclamation of 1763. This limited Western expansion past the Appalachian Mountains so they could organize their newly won territory. And then, they financially squeezed them with the 1765 Stamp Act. Guys, this was a massive shift. Parliament started imposing direct taxes on the colonies without even bothering to go through the colonial legislatures. And this phrase brilliantly illustrates the absolute crux of colonial frustration. The famous rallying cry, "No taxation without representation." The colonists flat out refused to pay. Now, they weren't necessarily opposed to the concept of taxes, right? But they were deeply, deeply opposed to being taxed directly by a parliament thousands of miles across an ocean where they had absolutely zero elected voice. So now a really deep ideological split begins to form. We aren't just talking about money anymore, folks. We're talking about two completely incompatible worldviews. On one side, you got monarchism, Europe's dominant system of top-down rule, and on the other side, this emerging colonial ideology of republicanism, which passionately demanded that any legitimate government actually requires the consent of the governed. Section 3, protests and violent crackdowns, a cycle of action and reaction. As this ideological divide widened and the economic squeeze really mounted, the colonies transitioned from philosophical debates in taverns to actual physical protests. We're entering a phase of rapid action and reaction that severely raised the temperature in our colonial boiling pot. I want you to think about a specific number: 5. Only 5 people died during a violent confrontation with British troops in Boston on March 5, 1770. Yet this deadly skirmish, which was very quickly dubbed the Boston Massacre, was utilized as a massive, massive piece of political propaganda. It spread like wildfire, fueling intense anti-British sentiment everywhere and uniting the colonists in their shared outrage against military occupation. Tensions just kept accelerating drastically by late 1773. On December 16th, colonists who were outraged by these ongoing taxes Specifically, a brand new tax on tea bypassed petitions entirely and took direct action. They destroyed heavily taxed imported goods right in the harbor, basically brewing the largest, saltiest cup of tea in history. It was an explosive event of defiance that, of course, went down as the Boston Tea Party. So what do you think? How did London respond to this incredibly brazen destruction of property? Did they recognize the severity of the colonists' anger and maybe back down a bit? Or did they decide to tighten their grip even further? Well, the crucial point here is that Britain chose a harsh, completely sweeping punishment. In 1774, they passed what the colonists appropriately called the Intolerable Acts. These acts essentially stripped Massachusetts of its historic right of self-government and imposed strict military rule. London's goal? To isolate Massachusetts and make a brutal example of them. But it completely backfired. It sparked outrage and resistance across all 13 colonies, ironically binding them together in solidarity. Moving to Section 4, the final straw and the point of no return. We've officially reached the boiling point. This is the exact moment where political protests finally give way to coordinated, armed resistance and the undeniable spark of war. Patriot leaders from every single colony realized they desperately needed a unified strategy, so they methodically organized their pushback. They convened the First Continental Congress, coordinated a massive colony-wide boycott of British trade, and published a formal list of rights and grievances to the king. Now, they were hoping against hope for a peaceful resolution here. But as their petitions were repeatedly ignored, they started preparing for the absolute worst. This rapid escalation finally culminated in the spring of 1775. On April 19th, the very first shots were fired at the battles of Lexington and Concord, which officially kicked off the Revolutionary War. The colonies moved incredibly swiftly to organize their defense. By June, the Second Continental Congress had already established a unified Continental Army and unanimously appointed George Washington as its commander-in-chief. Section 5, declaring independence and the birth of a unified nation. The final step in this masterclass of revolution is the legal and philosophical transition. It's that monumental shift from being protesting British subjects to becoming citizens of a brand new independent nation. Recognizing that reconciliation with the crown was just completely impossible after all that bloodshed, the Second Continental Congress took a massive, decisive step. On July 2, 1776, they officially voted to sever all ties with the British Empire and formally declare their independence. Adopted just 2 days later on July 4th, and drafted primarily by Thomas Jefferson, these enduring words became the foundational bedrock of the new republic. That all men are created equal, with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. You see, this document wasn't just some historic breakup letter to King George. It was a profound philosophical framework. It explicitly argued in favor of the rights of all citizens, it forcefully demanded the consent of the governed, and it permanently rejected the monarchism of the old world in favor of a bold new republican ideal. As we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a question to really ponder. How often do we take for granted the absolute fragility of the democratic ideals forged in this colonial pressure cooker? The very concept of the consent of the governed that completely defines our modern democracy, that was born from this rapid, dangerous, and violent escalation. So how vigilant must we be to maintain those exact principles today? Thanks for joining me, and keep exploring the history that shapes our world.